A queen wrapped in stardust and sand. Now close your eyes for a moment and imagine the warm night air of Alexandria. The moon floating above the harbor, the lighthouse burning like a second sun. And somewhere inside the royal palace, a young woman studying maps, scrolls, and languages long after everyone else has fallen asleep. That woman was Cleopatra, not yet a legend, not yet the queen who would challenge Rome, but simply a girl who understood, even then, that her destiny would never be ordinary. She wasn't the Cleopatra of Hollywood posters. No dramatic eyeliner or golden throne made her extraordinary. What set her apart was her mind, her voice, her courage to stand alone in a world ruled by empires, armies, and men who believed they were invincible. This is the story of a queen who could speak to scholars and charm generals, who loved her country fiercely, who played the most dangerous political game of her age and almost won. A queen who turned alliances into lifelines, who protected Egypt when the rest of the world saw it as treasure to be claimed, and who chose her own fate when the shadows finally closed in. Tonight, we'll walk beside her through candlelit halls, across the shimmering Nile, into meetings that shaped the ancient world. We'll meet Cleopatra not as a myth, but as a person, brilliant, vulnerable, strategic, and wonderfully alive. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the sands of time shift softly beneath your feet. Our journey begins in Alexandria, with a girl who would grow up to challenge Rome and leave a legend carved into history. Daughter of Pharaohs, child of Conquerors, Cleopatra VII Cleopatra ruled Egypt not once, but 4 times over, navigating a lifetime of shifting co-regencies and dangerous palace politics. First she stood beside her father, Ptolemy XII. Then, she reigned with each of her younger brothers in turn, and finally, she ruled with the son who would carry her lineage into legend. Across nearly 30 years, she remained the unshakable center of Egypt's last dynasty, a dynasty founded by Ptolemy, the Macedonian general who followed Alexander the Great into Egypt in 332 BC and stayed to build a kingdom in his name. From childhood, Cleopatra was unlike anyone else in her family. While most Ptolemies famously refused to learn Egyptian, she embraced the language, and not just Egyptian, Greek, Latin, Aramaic, and several others spoken across the eastern Mediterranean. Ancient writers described her not merely as educated but dazzlingly articulate, able to charm, negotiate, argue, and command with a voice that could disarm even her fiercest opponents. Her intelligence was not an ornament, it was her armor. In each of her co-regencies, Cleopatra was never the silent partner or ceremonial queen. She was the dominant ruler, the strategist, the diplomat, the one whose name truly carried the weight of Egypt's throne. She steered a declining kingdom through famine, debt, foreign pressure, and the rising tide of Roman expansion, using every skill she possessed to keep Egypt independent in a world where small nations were swallowed whole. Her alliances with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony were not the simple romances that popular culture loves to paint. They were political lifelines, carefully forged partnerships with the 2 most powerful men in the Roman world. And yet, they were also deeply human relationships, complicated, passionate, and shaped by genuine connection as much as by strategy. Cleopatra's beauty, often exaggerated by later writers, was said to lie less in her appearance and more in her presence, her intelligence, her wit, her charisma, her ability to make anyone feel seen and understood. Together with Caesar, she secured her throne. With Antony, she dreamed of a new Eastern Empire that could stand as Rome's equal. And though the tides of politics ultimately turned against her, her legend never dimmed. For 2,000 years, Cleopatra has been remembered not just as Egypt's last pharaoh, but as a woman who dared to rule in her own right, who shaped the destiny of nations, defied the greatest empire of her age, and left behind a myth woven from power, brilliance, tragedy, and an unforgettable will to survive. Cleopatra, early life and the road to the throne. Cleopatra VII entered the world not as a legend, but as a girl born into a dynasty already trembling under its own weight. No contemporary biography survives, no diary in her hand, no letters written by those who knew her, but through the voices of later Greek and Roman historians, especially Plutarch, we can trace the outlines of the young queen who would one day shake the foundations of empires. Born in 70 or 69 BC, Cleopatra was the daughter of Ptolemy XII Auletes, the flute player, a king whose love of luxury and unstable politics nearly cost Egypt its independence. Her mother was likely Cleopatra V. Tryphena, both wife and possibly half-sister to the king, in keeping with the customs of the Ptolemaic royal house. From birth, Cleopatra belonged to a lineage descending from Ptolemy I Soter, one of Alexander the Great's most trusted generals. She inherited not only the blood of conquerors but also the burden of a kingdom caught between fading glory and rising Roman power. And like many royals of her time, Cleopatra grew up deeply educated. She learned mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and spoke many languages, including, uniquely among the Ptolemies, Egyptian. She listened, observed, and prepared. Even as a child, she understood that in Alexandria's palace, survival depended on sharp wit as much as noble birth. When her father died in 51 BC, the throne passed to the 18-year-old Cleopatra and her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII. The tradition of sibling rule was meant to ensure unity. Instead, it opened the gates to rivalry. Behind the young boy stood ambitious advisors and generals who feared Cleopatra's intelligence and independence. They wanted a king they could control, not a queen capable of ruling on her own. Within months, Cleopatra found herself pushed out of power. In 49 BC, faced with conspiracies and growing hostility, she fled Egypt and sought refuge in Syria. But exile did not break her, it sharpened her resolve. She gathered mercenaries, forged alliances, and prepared for war. Cleopatra would not watch her kingdom slip away. She would fight for it. Meanwhile, Egypt had become entangled in Rome's own conflicts. After assassinating Pompey the Great, believing it would win them favor, the court of Ptolemy XIII welcomed Julius Caesar into Alexandria. They expected gratitude. They expected control. Instead, they found themselves caught between the two most ambitious minds of their age. The stage was set for an encounter that would change history. According to legend, Cleopatra secretly slipped into the royal palace, perhaps rolled inside a carpet, perhaps hidden in a linen sack, to speak with Caesar face to face. She came, not as a desperate exile, but as a ruler claiming her rightful throne. And Caesar listened. In the days that followed, Cleopatra's world shifted. She gained an ally, a protector, and soon a partner. The civil war with her brother ignited destinies entwined with the fate of Rome. History remembers Cleopatra's beauty, but those who wrote of her agreed it was her mind, her charm, her presence, quiet, calculated, mesmerizing, that won hearts, shaped alliances, and ultimately made her unforgettable. Caesar and Cleopatra. Power, politics, and the birth of Caesarion. For Julius Caesar, Egypt was not merely a diversion, it was a necessity. He had arrived in Alexandria chasing Pompey during Rome's civil war, but he quickly realized he needed more than victory. He needed money, vast amounts of it, to stabilize his position back in Rome and Egypt, wealthy beyond imagination thanks to its grain, gold, and trade. owed a fortune to Caesar because of Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII Auletes. To secure his return to power, Caesar needed Egypt stable, and to stabilize Egypt, he needed Cleopatra. What followed was for months of brutal, close-quarters fighting. Caesar's forces were outnumbered and stranded on foreign soil. The city of Alexandria became a labyrinth of fire, barricades, and shifting alliances. The famous library may have suffered damage in these chaotic days, though historians still debate the extent. At last, Roman reinforcements arrived by sea. Ptolemy XIII, realizing the tide had turned, fled, only to drown in the Nile, his golden armor dragging him beneath the water. He was barely 15 years old. Caesar entered Alexandria not as a friend, but as an unwelcome conqueror. Yet despite the animosity of the citizens, he restored Cleopatra as queen, this time alongside her younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, barely 13. The throne was hers again, but through the authority of Rome. And then something unexpected happened. Caesar stayed. Their relationship, political, strategic, and deeply personal, unfolded behind the perfumed curtains of Alexandria's palace. Cleopatra knew how to create an atmosphere that blended luxury with intellect. She dazzled Caesar not with beauty alone, but with conversation, confidence, and her ability to weave Egypt's ancient majesty into her presence. Cleopatra was not merely a queen. She was a cultural force. In 47 BCE, she gave birth to a son, Ptolemy Caesar, known to Egyptians as Caesarion, Little Caesar. To the Roman Senate, his paternity was a scandalous rumor. To Cleopatra, he was the future of two empires. Cleopatra in Rome. Sometime in 46 to 45 BC, Cleopatra journeyed to Rome with Ptolemy XIV and the toddler Caesarion. She stayed in a villa across the Tiber, causing whispers everywhere she went. Romans were fascinated and rattled by her presence. She came not as a guest, but as a statement. Caesar even placed a golden statue of her in the temple of Venus Genetrix, associating her with Rome's founding goddess. To some, it was homage. To others, a provocation. Caesar was already reshaping Rome's politics, and now he seemed to be reshaping its traditions, too. Then, on the Ides of March in 44 BC, Caesar was murdered. His assassination plunged Rome into chaos, and Cleopatra, understanding danger instantly, left for Egypt. Her survival depended on returning before Rome's factions could use her or Caesarion as pawns. Soon after her return, her co-ruler Ptolemy XIV died, likely poisoned, almost certainly by Cleopatra's order. It was ruthless, but necessary. She made her 3-year-old son co-regent as Ptolemy XV Caesarion, giving him both Egyptian legitimacy and the echo of Roman divinity. The queen who became Isis. By this time, Cleopatra had fully embraced the mantle of Isis, the divine mother, healer, and protector. Egyptian tradition expected kings and queens to reflect gods. Cleopatra turned that expectation into an identity. She was no longer merely queen, she was the new Isis, embodiment of rebirth and power. She was a polyglot, speaking as many as a dozen languages. She negotiated without translators, charmed without effort, and ruled with a mixture of warmth and steel. Plutarch wrote that her allure was not in her beauty but in her voice, her charisma, her presence. Cleopatra now stood at the height of her power. She had a son, a throne, wealth, and a kingdom that needed her. But Rome was not finished with Egypt, and another Roman titan was about to enter her life, one who would shape her fate as profoundly as Caesar had. Cleopatra and Mark Antony. When politics became destiny, with her young son Caesarion beside her on the throne, Cleopatra ruled Egypt with more confidence than ever before. But even queens cannot command the river. The Nile's floods faltered, harvests shrank, and famine pressed against the streets of Alexandria. Grain prices soared. Temples did what they could, but hunger has a way of shaking even ancient kingdoms. At the same time, the Roman world, always restless, was tearing itself apart again. A new power bloc had formed, the Second Triumvirate, made up of Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus. On the other side stood Caesar's assassins, Brutus and Cassius. Both factions demanded Egypt's loyalty. Cleopatra waited, watched, calculated, and finally sent for veteran Roman legions that Caesar had once stationed in Egypt. Those troops marched under the triumvirs' banners and helped them win the decisive battles of Philippi in 42 BC. With victory came a new division of the Roman world. Octavian claimed the west. Antony took the east. Lepidus received whatever was left. Cleopatra now stood between two immense forces, and one of them, Mark Antony, was about to call her into his orbit. The summons to Tarsus. Antony demanded she come to the city of Tarsus to explain her political choices after Caesar's murder. It was not exactly a polite invitation. In the old days, a Roman general summoning a foreign monarch meant only one thing: submission. But Cleopatra was no ordinary monarch. When she sailed up the Cydnus River, she turned a political interrogation into a performance that would echo through history. Plutarch tells us she appeared as the goddess Isis, her barge clothed in gold, her attendants dressed like cupids. They are thick with incense. Music drifted across the water. Purple sails shimmered in the sun. It was a spectacle crafted not for vanity but for strategy. Antony, who fancied himself a new Dionysus, was enthralled. Cleopatra did not bow, she conquered. Not with armies, but with presence, with charisma, and the ancient majesty of Egypt woven into every gesture. What began as a political hearing became a declaration of alliance and something more intimate, magnetic, and dangerous. A pact of power, and Antony promised to protect Cleopatra's throne and honor Egypt's independence. He agreed to eliminate her sister Arsinoe, the last surviving rival from the earlier civil war, who lived uneasily in exile. Cleopatra returned to Alexandria with the support she needed. Antony followed. He left behind his wife Fulvia and their children in Rome. He left behind the expectations of senators and allies. In Alexandria he found not just a queen, but a world one of luxury, philosophy, celebration, and intoxicating brilliance. Cleopatra welcomed him into a city that glowed at night like a jeweled crown. There, in the heart of the palace, they formed their infamous drinking society, the inimitable Livers, a circle devoted to feasts, wine, games, and clever conversation. But beneath the revelry was strategy. Together, they explored the possibility of an Eastern Empire, Rome and Egypt entwined, the birth of the solar and lunar twins. When Antony finally returned to Rome in 40 BC, Cleopatra stayed in Alexandria, but she did not stay alone. She was carrying his children. That same year she gave birth to twins, Alexander Helios, named for the sun, a symbol of radiant kingship, and Cleopatra Selene, named for the moon, a sign of mystery and grace. Their names reflected not just love, but ambition to celestial bodies. Two heirs born at the crossroads of Rome and Egypt. Cleopatra's bond with Antony was no longer a rumor or a political alliance. It was a dynasty in the making. Cleopatra, power struggled after the death of Fulvia, Mark Antony's politically ambitious wife, whose rebellion against Octavian had nearly plunged Rome into another civil war. Antony found himself in a vulnerable position. He needed reconciliation, not mourning. The only way to restore trust with Octavian was through a political act Rome would understand: a marriage. And so Antony married Octavian's half-sister Octavia, a woman celebrated for her dignity, loyalty, and Roman virtues. It was not a marriage of passion, but of survival. Cleopatra understood this perfectly. Roman unions were tools, not vows. And while Antony bound himself to Octavia, It was in Egypt, not Rome, that Cleopatra's true power flourished. Under her rule, Egypt grew wealthy and stable. Alexandria pulsed with commerce. Its libraries and palaces thrived. Its markets overflowed with grain, spices, wine, and gold. Cleopatra stood at the center of this prosperity, poised, calculating, and shaken by Rome's political theater. In 37 BC, Antony and Cleopatra arranged a meeting in Antioch. Officially, it was diplomacy. In reality, it was a gravitational pull to rulers, to ambitions, circling back toward one another. Antony needed the vast resources of Egypt, and Cleopatra needed the military force that only Rome could provide. Their alliance was renewed not only with negotiations but with intimacy. Cleopatra agreed to finance Antony's long-delayed campaign against Parthia, Rome's greatest eastern rival. In return, Antony restored to her a vast swath of former Egyptian territories: Cyprus, Crete, Cyrenaica, Jericho, and large stretches of Syria and Lebanon. Cleopatra's empire now stretched across continents, a dominion so expansive that even Rome grew uneasy. Not long after, Cleopatra bore Antony another child, Ptolemy Philadelphos, a symbol of their renewed bond and of their shared political future. But Antony's attempt to win glory in Parthia ended in disaster. His army suffered from harsh winters, desert ambushes, and relentless Parthian horsemen. It was one of Rome's most humiliating defeats, and Antony returned wounded in pride and power. Octavia, ever loyal, traveled with reinforcements and supplies to mend their relationship and aid his mission. Antony refused to see her. Publicly rejecting a virtuous Roman wife was more than ungrateful, it was scandalous. For Octavian, it was a perfect opportunity. He weaponized Antony's rejection, painting him as a man bewitched, ruled not by Roman duty but by the seductive will of an Eastern queen, determined to reclaim honor. Antony returned to Alexandria and staged one of the most dramatic political spectacles in ancient history, the donations of Alexandria. In a lavish ceremony echoing ancient pharaonic rituals, Antony proclaimed Caesarion as the true son and rightful heir of Julius Caesar, directly challenging Octavian's adopted claim. He distributed kingdoms to each of his children, with Cleopatra, elevating them as rulers in waiting across the Mediterranean world. Cleopatra herself was hailed as Queen of Kings, and Antony as King of Kings. It was a declaration not just of power, but of an alternate future in which Rome was no longer the center of the world. A future in which Egypt through Cleopatra would rise as the axis of a new empire. Rome erupted. Octavian seized the moment with ruthless skill. He accused Antony of betraying Roman values, abandoning his wife, and falling under Cleopatra's Eastern spell. Propaganda spread like wildfire. Antony would make Alexandria the new capital. Roman citizens would kneel to a foreign queen. Caesar's legacy had been corrupted by Cleopatra's ambitions. By late 32 BC, the Senate struck the decisive blow. Antony was stripped of all titles. His supporters were branded enemies of the state, and Rome declared war not on Antony, but on Cleopatra. This distinction was no accident. It reframed the coming conflict not as another civil war, but as Rome defending itself against a foreign monarch. Octavian was no longer fighting his rival, he was fighting to save Rome from Cleopatra. And so, the final act began. Egypt and Rome stood on opposite shores. Cleopatra and Antony, once dazzling in power and promise, now faced the gathering storm together with no safe harbor left. Cleopatra, defeat and death, then began on a warm September morning in 31 BC, on the waters off the coast of Greece. At Actium, Octavian's disciplined navy faced the combined forces of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, two rulers bound by love, ambition, and the hope of forging a new world beyond Rome's grasp. But the sea carried no mercy that day. As the battle raged, Cleopatra saw the tide turning against them. Octavian's ships pressed inward, tightening their noose. According to ancient accounts, she made a desperate choice, perhaps tactical, perhaps emotional. She ordered her fleet to break formation and flee toward Egypt. Antony, seeing her flagship retreating, was torn between commander and lover. In the chaos, he chose Cleopatra. Abandoning the battle, he followed her with a small escort of ships, leaving his remaining forces to collapse under Octavian's assault. Rome would never forgive him for this. Back in Egypt, the lovers tried to gather alliances and defenses, but Octavian was relentless. His armies advanced on Alexandria with cold efficiency, and morale within the city crumbled. The world Antony once commanded had slipped through his fingers. Then came the lie that broke him. As Octavian's legions drew near, a rumor spread like wildfire: Cleopatra was dead. Whether whispered by traitors or born of confusion, Antony believed it. Convinced that the woman he had abandoned Rome for the woman he believed he could not live without had taken her own life, he made his final decision. In the quiet of his chambers, Mark Antony fell upon his sword, but fate is cruel in timing. As he lay bleeding, servants revealed the truth: Cleopatra lived. She had taken refuge in her mausoleum, not her tomb. Antony, gravely wounded, begged to be taken to her. In one of history's most tragic scenes, he was lifted up to the window where she waited. Cleopatra and her attendants drew him inside, and he died in her arms, reconciled, heartbroken, and defeated. With Antony gone and Octavian at her gates, Cleopatra saw only deposits, humiliation, or control. Octavian sought to parade her through Rome in chains, a living trophy of the East, proof of his triumph. Cleopatra understood the symbolism. Rome would not just conquer Egypt. It would conquer her body, her story, her dignity. She refused. On August 1230 BC, after overseeing Antony's burial and negotiating what she knew were empty terms with Octavian, Cleopatra withdrew into her private chambers, accompanied only by her two most loyal servants, Charmian and Iores. The door closed behind them, and no Roman soldier was permitted entry. What happened next remains one of history's greatest mysteries. Ancient writers, especially Plutarch, claim she arranged for a venomous asp to be smuggled into her chambers. The asp, sacred to Egyptian royalty and symbol of divine authority, was said to have delivered a painless, almost ritual death. Others believed she used a poisoned ointment, or a hollow pin laced with toxin. The truth lies lost to time, but the result endures. Cleopatra, last pharaoh of Egypt, died at 39 years old, a queen choosing her own ending rather than allowing Rome to script it for her, according to her final wish. She was buried beside Mark Antony, the man she loved and the partner she fought beside until the end. Their deaths cleared the path for Octavian, soon to be Augustus, the first Roman emperor to absorb Egypt into his empire and solidify his absolute power. With Cleopatra's passing, a 3,000-year pharaonic lineage came to its final breath. But her legend: queen, strategist, lover, polyglot, ruler, became immortal. Ten little-known truths about Cleopatra, the woman behind the legend. Cleopatra VII is one of history's most mythologized women. Yet the real queen was far more complex than the seductress described by Rome. Behind the legends lies a ruler of brilliance, strategy, and extraordinary cultural fusion. These 10 lesser-known truths reveal a Cleopatra who was not merely a figure in scandalous tales, but a sovereign who shaped the fate of nations. Cleopatra was not Egyptian by blood, though she ruled Egypt and is forever linked to its sands and temples. Her lineage traced back to Macedonian Greece, to Ptolemy I Soter, the general who took Egypt after Alexander the Great's death. Yet Cleopatra did something none of her Ptolemaic ancestors attempted. She embraced Egypt wholeheartedly. She learned the language, adopted its religious traditions, and presented herself as the living Isis, transforming foreign blood into native legitimacy. Like many ancient dynasties, the Ptolemies preserved power through royal inbreeding. Cleopatra was almost certainly the child of a sibling marriage, just as she herself ceremonially married her younger brothers Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV. These unions were political, not romantic ritual ties meant to reinforce her position in a court where family was both ally and threat. Despite the legends, Cleopatra's beauty was not her strongest weapon. Roman propaganda, especially from her enemies, painted her as a manipulative temptress. In reality, her power came from her intelligence, charisma, and eloquence. She reportedly spoke as many as a dozen languages and excelled in mathematics, philosophy, rhetoric, and astronomy. Plutarch wrote that her allure was not altogether incomparable, but her voice, wit, and charm were irresistible. She captivated minds before she ever touched hearts. Survival in the Ptolemaic court required a sharp blade and a sharper mind. Cleopatra had a hand in the political downfall or death of 3 of her siblings, each maneuver necessary in a world where assassination and exile were the tools of succession. Ptolemy XIII forced her into exile, prompting her alliance with Caesar. Her second brother-husband, Ptolemy XIV, likely died by her command so Caesarion could become co-regent. Her sister Arsinoe, a rival claimant, was executed at Cleopatra's insistence. These acts were not cruelty, they were strategy in a dynasty where any hesitation meant death. Cleopatra also understood the power of theatrical diplomacy. She mastered the art of the entrance, famously smuggling herself to Caesar wrapped in a carpet, and later arriving to meet Mark Antony in a golden barge with purple sails and silver oars. Dressed as Aphrodite, surrounded by attendants as cupids. She knew politics was a stage and she was its star performer. During her relationship with Caesar, Cleopatra lived openly in Rome, causing fascination and scandal alike. Caesar erected a gilded statue of her in the Temple of Venus, an unprecedented honor that dazzled some Romans and outraged others. Her influence sparked trends in fashion, hairstyles, makeup, and pearls, and many statues of Roman women were later mistaken for Cleopatra because so many imitated her look. Her relationship with Mark Antony was political, strategic, and deeply personal. Together, they formed the Inimitable Livers, a private drinking society dedicated to feasts, games, and extravagant mischief. Ancient writers describe them roaming Alexandria in disguise, and using themselves with pranks on the unsuspecting. Far from the grim portraits painted by Rome, Cleopatra and Antony's life in Egypt was filled with laughter, indulgence, and shared ambition. Cleopatra was not simply a lover or diplomat, she was a military leader. In 31 BC, during the Battle of Actium, she personally commanded a portion of Egypt's fleet beside Antony. Though overwhelmed by Octavian's superior forces, her decision to break through the enemy line and retreat to Egypt was bold, strategic, and reflective of a ruler who acted, not merely watched. Her death, like her life, has been cloaked in mystery and legend. The classic story tells of an aspite, a royal and symbolic suicide. Yet ancient writers admit that no one truly knew how she died. Some believe she used poison hidden in a hairpin. Others say she applied a lethal ointment. Modern scholars tend to favor a swift toxin delivered with a concealed needle, more controlled and reliable than coaxing a snake. Whatever the method, Cleopatra chose sovereignty in death rather than humiliation in life. Even centuries after her fall, Cleopatra continued to inspire legend. The 1963 film Cleopatra, starring Elizabeth Taylor, became one of the most expensive films ever made, nearly bankrupting its studio. It proved that Cleopatra's spell had never faded. Her story demanded spectacle, grandeur, and all just as she had in life. Cleopatra was far more than the lover of powerful men. She was a linguist, a strategist, a queen who commanded fleets, shaped alliances, and defied an empire. These 10 truths peel back the myth to reveal the astonishing woman beneath a ruler who lived not only in history, but in imagination, forever refusing to fade. Did Cleopatra really die by snakebite? The myth, the mystery, and the final hours of Egypt's last queen. The death of Cleopatra VII is one of the most iconic moments in ancient history, dramatic, poetic, and wrapped in more legend than fact. For centuries, storytellers have imagined the queen lying on a golden couch, serene and composed, a deadly asp coiled at her arm. It is a haunting image that shaped art, movies, and imagination. But as with many chapters of Cleopatra's life, the truth is far more complex and far more mysterious. After the devastating defeat at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, Cleopatra and Mark Antony retreated to Alexandria. Watching their empire crumble piece by piece, their former allies deserted them. The wealth of Egypt drained away. Roman forces under Octavian closed in with relentless pressure. The once lavish inimitable livers, their circle of feasts, wine, and theatrical games, dissolved forever. In its place, Cleopatra formed a new, darker fellowship, the Companions to Death. She ordered the construction of a 2-story mausoleum next to the Temple of Isis, not as a distant future tomb, but as the stage for the final act she knew would come. By late July of 30 BC, Octavian's troops had stormed Alexandria. Cleopatra retreated into her mausoleum. Antony, believing a false rumor that she had already taken her life, fell on his sword. Mortally wounded, he was carried to her refuge, where he died in her arms, a final, tragic echo of the bond that had defined a generation. With Antony dead and Egypt slipping beyond saving, Cleopatra faced a cruel choice. According to Plutarch, she received a secret warning. Octavian intended to take her alive, parade her through Roman chains, and use her humiliation to cement his own power. For a queen who believed herself the living embodiment of Isis, such a spectacle was a fate worse than death. On August 12, 30 BC, Cleopatra withdrew into her mausoleum with her two loyal attendants, Pharaohs and Charmian. She sent a calm, final note to Octavian requesting only one thing: to be buried beside Antony. When Octavian's guards broke down the door, they found Cleopatra lifeless on a golden couch, her two handmaidens dead or dying beside her. The last pharaoh of Egypt was gone at just 39 years old, ending a reign of more than 2 decades. The most enduring legend claims Cleopatra ended her life with the bite of an asp or an Egyptian cobra, the symbol of royalty worn by pharaohs as the sacred uraeus. It is the perfect dramatic flourish, the queen dying by the emblem of her kingdom, embracing a fate as theatrical as her life. But historians now see several problems with this tale. Egyptian cobras are large, far too big to hide in a basket of figs, as the story suggests. Not all snake bites are lethal, and those that are often kill slowly and painfully. It is extremely unlikely a snake could have killed Cleopatra and both her attendants swiftly enough to match the timing described in the sources. More likely, Cleopatra used a fast-acting poison, a method far more consistent with her intelligence, planning, and desire for control. Ancient historians like Strabo hinted she may have applied a toxic ointment or concealed a needle dipped in venom in a hair comb. Modern scholars propose mixtures such as hemlock, opium, and wolfsbane, swift, deadly, and subtle. In 2010, historian Christoph Schwer, working with a toxicologist, concluded that a lethal herbal concoction was the most plausible cause of death. There is another possibility, that Octavian himself helped shape her end. Cleopatra alive was a threat, a charismatic, royal, adored by many. Cleopatra dead was a useful symbol, a story he could craft and include in his memoirs. Once she was gone, Octavian ordered the execution of Caesarion, her teenage son, by Julius Caesar, eliminating any challenge to his authority. He then annexed Egypt as a Roman province, later becoming Emperor Augustus, the first of Rome's emperors, founder of a new age. In the end, the truth of Cleopatra's death remains veiled in uncertainty. No eyewitness account survives. Ancient biographers like Plutarch wrote long after the events and relied on sources already shaped by Roman politics and propaganda. For generations, poets, playwrights, and filmmakers added their embellishments, building Cleopatra into a myth, a queen defined by seduction, tragedy, and unforgettable drama. But behind this myth was a real woman, brilliant, multilingual, politically shrewd, and fiercely determined. Whether she died by serpent, poison, or quiet Roman orchestration, she ensured one thing with absolute certainty: she would never be paraded in chains, and she would choose her own ending. Perhaps Plutarch said it best: the truth of the matter no one knows. And so Cleopatra's final moment remains a mystery, one last secret guarded by the queen who refused to be forgotten. The queen who refused to fade. Cleopatra's story does not end in her tomb. It lives on in marble, in myth, and the restless imagination of every age that came after her. For centuries, she has been painted as many things: a temptress, a tyrant, a goddess, a scholar, a survivor. But beyond every legend lies a woman who fought, fiercely and brilliantly, to protect her kingdom in a world ruled by empires and ambition. She spoke the languages of nations, mastered the politics of giants, and stood unafraid before the greatest powers of her time. She shaped her destiny with a clarity that still feels modern. If the world would write her story without her consent, she would take the pen back into her own hands. Rome won the war, but Cleopatra won the memory. Her name still glitters like gold beneath desert sands. Her choices bold, flawed, human echo across millennia. Her death marked the fall of Egypt's ancient line, yet her spirit became something far greater, a symbol of sovereignty, resilience, and unbroken will to remain oneself, even when surrounded by giants. And so the last pharaoh lives on, not as a shadow in Rome's triumph, but as a legend who dared to challenge an empire and chose her own ending. In stone and papyrus, in art and imagination, Cleopatra still speaks, and the world is still listening.